The system we have had for the last 25 years, the Chinese have been able to take advantage of it. And that's part of the problem, because they're able to hollow out the economies of a lot of the less developed countries. At the same time, they're able to hollow out the manufacturing base of the more advanced economies. And in exchange, the rest of the world has got cheap goods, and that's about it. And that's one of the reasons why we've had this independent Chinese rise. They've basically been able to transfer parts of the global system because of the lack of institutions to the Chinese system, and that is what has undermined everything else. That's what's got to stop. The Chinese decision to back the Russians in this war has really changed mindsets. Let me give you two things. I mean, there's a dozen major reasons that I don't think the Chinese system is going to survive this decade, but let me give you the two that are absolutely unassailable. First of all, China is the third most internationally integrated country in the world after the Germans and the Koreans. They are utterly dependent upon globalized access to raw materials and markets the world over. They import the raw materials, they import the technology. People forget that piece sometimes, and then they export the finished goods. That does not work without a globalized world, and there is no coalition of countries that can replace the United States as the guarantor of that world. And with the Americans going their own way, that's it. The entire economic model doesn't work. Semiconductors is probably the best space to see how exposed the Chinese are. They can't make the high-end or the mid-end chips, and they can't make the equipment to make the low-end chips. They're completely dependent upon tech transfers from the rest of the world in order to sustain that entire industry. And now we have the Dutch, the Danes, the Brits, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Taiwanese, along with the Americans, saying that never again can the Chinese access high-end chips at all. And the question is, what mid-end chips can they have, and whether they should be able to have the equipment necessary to make the low-end chips. So we're talking in the course of just the last few months, their access to that space has stopped. If the Chinese have a significant policy change and kind of sue for peace as part of a globalization 2.0, there's definitely a conversation to be had there. I don't mean to suggest that that aspect of this is past the point of no return. That the W administration tried back before the 9/11 attacks, trying to bring China into a new revitalized globalized system. Obviously, we all got a little bit distracted about them. But the second problem, unfortunately, is much worse, and that's the demographic situation. According to the Chinese themselves, with the data they're starting to let out, they've overcounted their population by over 100 million people. All of those overcounts were people who would have been born since the one-child policy has been adopted, which was 40 years ago, so people 40 and under. And they were already looking at one of the fastest drop-offs in terms of birth rate in human history. You need 2.1 births per woman to maintain your population. In their metro centers, they're now below 0.7. I mean, this is faster than the Korean drop-off, and they haven't developed nearly as much as the Koreans have. So if these numbers are true, they're going to lose almost 2 Americas of population in just the next 30 years. And the average age will be older than the Japanese are now. This is not something, we don't even have a model. If you're talking about a population that drops by almost half in 30 years and the people that are left are in their 50s and 60s, I don't see how that can function. But we are in unprecedented times. I get surprised all the time. Is it theoretically possible that the United States will force some sort of second phase globalization on the world? Yes, but what made globalization 1 work is most of the world was devastated. And not only was the American deal good, it was really the only one on the table. I don't think there's a belief at this point that the United States is willing to go that far or cut to the bone that much on economic matters in order to get its way. The American political system really is in a period of retrenchment, regardless of what happens with Biden and Trump. And the degree of leadership that would require, and the degree of acceptance that the rest of the world would have to generate, I don't think that's on deck. Let me give you 2 reasons. One is why I don't think the Chinese would go for it, and the second one, how I would do it if I was, king for a day. The Chinese have degraded into a cult of personality that makes Mao look inclusive. And they have become hostage to their own ideology, and it's leading to a series of cascading policy decisions across the system. The COVID policy is one of those. And the capacity of the Chinese system to adapt and get out of its own way, at least at the moment, is gone. Xi has killed the messenger so many times that it's difficult to get him any real information. And it's only in this last week that he's finally had a face-to-face with anyone for the first time in almost 3 years. So their ability to move beyond the blind ideology of the propaganda arm is seriously constrained at the moment. On the United States side, assuming that the Americans can kind of get their political ducks in a row at home enough to have this conversation, the first step would be to start with the inner family. So the other Anglo states and the Mexicans, and kind of do a first round NAFTA extension combination security and economic deal. The second phase would be to bring in the countries that are consolidated already, that have good relations with the United States. You would need a formal globalization 2.0 version that fuses economic and security issues into a single governing system. It's not national merger, but it's something a lot more formal than just the Article 5 guarantees of NATO and the adjudication systems of NAFTA. Something where it's all under one roof, and we'd all agree to the ground rules at the same time. So human rights, free enterprise, physical defense, all part of the same association. Kind of like what some supporters of the European Union would like to see the EU become.
And what would be the advantage over our current arrangements in having such a
Right now, it's very bilateral and it's very ad hoc. And if you're talking about something that is designed at the end to be an overarching system, it needs to be together. And if you're talking about something that is going to be able to bring the Chinese into it, it has to be potent. You're not going to do that with a simple bilateral deal. You have to have an enforcement mechanism. And we've learned over and over and over that the Chinese are unwilling to do that unless they are forced. Entities outside of China to be able to adjudicate disputes with the Chinese outside of China and have it stick. Right now, under pre-existing systems, we sue the Chinese, including at the WTO. The decision is imposed, and the Chinese just move on. That's not how it works if you're going to have a system that really sticks. You've got to end what has been a relatively exploitive position that the Chinese have taken versus the rest of the world. I'm not sure there's any policy change that can save the Chinese at this point. But if the United States is going to go back into a position of de facto subsidizing a lot of the world, the baseline understandings have to evolve. And part of that means getting institutions in place that the United States maybe doesn't control, but certainly heavily influences, that are enforceable.